Welcome, everyone, to the Real News Network. My name is Maximillian Alvarez. I'm the editor-in-chief here at the Real News, and it's so great to have you all with us. Today is Monday, March 28th, and the full-scale Russian military invasion of Ukraine that began on February 24th has entered its second month. Over 3.8 million refugees have fled Ukraine for neighboring countries, according to estimates from the United Nations High Commission for Refugees. And as Patrick J. McDonnell, Marcus Yam, Jawed Kaleem, and Laura King recently wrote in the LA Times, quote, even as Ukraine continued to tout an emerging ability to launch counterattacks against a far stronger invading force, the start of the war's second month brought fresh evidence of the horrifying toll in civilian lives. Ukrainian officials said Friday that at least 300 people had died in a Russian airstrike this month on a theater in the encircled port city of Mariupol, apparently the war's worst single episode of civilian fatalities, end quote. According to the latest updates from Reuters, quote, Moscow signaled on Friday it was scaling back its ambitions in Ukraine to focus on territory claimed by Russian-backed separatists in the east as Ukrainian forces went on the offensive to recapture towns outside the capital of Kyiv. In an announcement that appeared to indicate more limited goals, the Russian Defense Ministry said a first phase of its operation was mostly complete, and it would now focus on the eastern Donbas region, which has pro-Russian separatist enclaves, end quote. Now, peace talks between Russia and Ukraine are set to take place in Turkey this week, but fears of global escalation intensified after President Joe Biden delivered a dramatic speech in Warsaw, Poland on Saturday, culminating in a line addressing Russian President Vladimir Putin, quote, for God's sake, this man cannot remain in power, Biden said. In a tweet on the same day, President Biden also said, quote, we are engaged anew in a great battle for freedom, a battle between democracy and autocracy, between liberty and repression. This battle will not be won in days or months either. We need to steel ourselves for the long fight ahead, end quote. So, news about the war in Ukraine is coming out by the minute, and circumstances may very well have changed by the time this interview is published. As always, we here at The Real News will do our best to bring our audiences up-to-date information and analysis of events as they unfold, not just in video form, but in the many text articles and podcasts we publish on our website on a weekly basis. And we will also be working hard to bring y'all the voices and context behind the headlines so that viewers and listeners can better navigate the fog of war, better understand how we got here, and fight harder for peace. Today, we continue our effort to bring our audiences a range of interviews with folks on the ground in Russia and Ukraine, specialists whose expertise can help explain the deeper context behind this horrific war, as well as activists, organizers, and media makers who are fighting for peace not only in Ukraine, but in Palestine, Yemen, Afghanistan, and beyond. As always, I want to make it clear that none of these interviews is intended to be the single definitive take on any of the vital questions we'll be exploring, and that they should be taken as part of a collective, expanding effort to know what the hell is going on and to remember who and what we are fighting for. If there are any questions or viewpoints that you all want us to discuss or are having trouble navigating yourselves, please reach out to us and we will work to address them in a way that is informative, principled, honest, and usable. In today's interview, we're going to try to examine and contextualize the war in Ukraine within the larger scope of Russian history, with two specialists who have studied that history exhaustively and for many years. And those studies, in many ways, culminated in this big and important book called Russia's Empires, which was published by Oxford University Press in 2017, co-authored by Professor Ronald Grigor Suny and Professor Valerie Kivelson from the University of Michigan, my old alma mater, where I was a graduate student. So Professor Ronald Grigor Suny is the William H. Sewell Jr. Distinguished University Professor of History and Professor of Political Science at the University of Michigan, and he is the Emeritus Professor of Political Science and History at the University of Chicago. He is the author of many, many books, including They Can Live in the Desert But Nowhere Else, A History of the Armenian Genocide, Red Flag Unfurled, Historians, The Russian Revolution and the Soviet Experiment, and Stalin, Passage to Revolution. And Valerie A. Kivelson is the Thomas N. Tentler Collegiate Professor and Arthur F. Thurnau Professor of History at the University of Michigan. She's the author and editor of numerous books, including Cartographies of Tsardom, The Land and Its Meaning in 17th Century Russia, Picturing Russia, Explorations in Visual Culture, and Desperate Magic, The Moral Economy of Witchcraft in 17th Century Russia. Professors, thank you so much for joining me today.
Thanks for having us.
Well, I've been really, really wanting to talk to you both, and I've been thinking about you a lot and your book a lot as this is all unfolded, not just because, I used to be a graduate student in your department, but, because there really are a lot of important insights in this book that I think can really help the way that we are all collectively trying to understand what we're watching unfold. And as I'm sure you have noticed more than others, it's been especially odd, for instance, to see people on mainstream media uncritically discussing how Putin wants to, quote, revive the Soviet empire. At the same time, in other corners of political discourse, including those occupied by the Western left, it can seem like empire is a term that can only be used when referring to Western powers, particularly the US. And often Lenin's famous definition of imperialism as the highest stage of capitalism will be brandished by way of asserting that the terms empire and imperialism actually have no meaningful application to Putin's Russia and can thus tell us nothing about why this war is happening or what the endgame might be. So this, of course, is a big reason why I wanted to talk to you both today, given that your book explicitly examines the vast sweep of Russian history through the lens of empire, and you take great care to establish what you do and don't mean by empire. And so the last thing I'll say before we really get going here for viewers and listeners is that ultimately, I think the biggest goal for this conversation is not to try to sum up Ron and Val's expansive, rich research in this book in the span of a 1-hour conversation, because that would be impossible. The book covers a millennium's worth of history of the territory and people we now call Russia. Instead, what I'm hoping to do is translate just a fraction of your brilliant work in the book and your expertise into an analytical and historical frame that people can arm themselves with to first be more critical, historically informed thinkers and media consumers, when most media right now is asking us to do and be the opposite. And second, to have a more robust and specific understanding of the concepts of empire and imperialism as we try to make sense of this war, how and why it's happening, and what imperial motivations may or may not be driving it. Okay. That's all the kind of like pre-context I'm going to give. So why don't we start, if it's okay, familiarizing viewers and listeners with your book as best we can in the beginning of this conversation. So could y'all talk a bit about just, how the origin story of this book, how it came about, what central questions you wanted to answer, and what sort of dominant historiographical trends and popular conceptions you were pushing against? And I guess what sort of key conceptual frames and historical evidence really hold the book together?
Okay. So first of all, this is a wonderful opportunity to talk about this book. I love this book. I think Val loves this book. We keep thinking about it. We get nice comments from people about it. And I think it's become, in some ways, very relevant given what's happened recently with this unprovoked attack on Ukraine. And we're trying to use the concepts that we developed in the book to try to understand what the hell is going on here. The book began in a series of discussions and comments and dinner parties between Val and me over many years. We taught several times together, and we were both interested in this concept of Russia's empires. I was asked by Oxford University Press to write a textbook history of all of Russian history. I did not want to do that. I proposed to Val that we write this book together. Her expertise is in early Russia, Russian history, the imperial period, the pre-imperial period. I do mostly the 20th century, and now by default, the 21st century, the Soviet period, and now the post-Soviet period. So it seemed a really good symbiosis, a good way to combination to work together on this. And she agreed, and we began working on it. And the best thing about it was in collaboration that though we did not agree on all aspects, we learned from that collaboration. So I would say that I tend to be, in some ways, a radical simplifier. I studied political science and was in a political science department for 10 years at Chicago. And so I was looking for the bottom line. So I might see things more black and white. Val has a more complex view of things. She sees things sort of in, I'd say gray and beige, maybe, with lots of nuances. And that was so helpful to me. So the book became richer and richer as we went deeper and deeper into this history. I'm going to say one more thing. We had some discussions early on about the earliest periods of Russian history, before Russia itself became an empire. And these are periods that Val knows very well. And we decided to put those periods into the book as well, to talk about what it was before it was an empire. And in some sense, what it is after the Soviet empire, and we did call the Soviet Union empire, collapsed, right? What is Russia today? How much of a nation state is it? How much of an empire is it? And in discussing those earliest chapters, we talked about what has now become one of the most complicated and complex discussions and conflicts between Russia and Ukraine, between historians of Ukraine and historians of Russia, and that is what's called Kievan Rus. And in some ways, this Kievan Rus, which we decided was not even a state, has become the origin point, the beginning of the histories of two now quite antagonistic states. So it's worth reading that complex history to see the way the vagaries of that history actually are understood and how they've been mythologized into these origin stories.
First, taking off on what Ron just said about the early Rus period. Rus is what that very early medieval period is known as, and it's extremely contentious today. It already was when we were writing this book, and we thought long and hard about including that early period, not only because there's certainly no empire in evidence, there's not even a state, as Ron says, but also because there's real discomfort in the actually imperial move of including that Kievan past in as the origin story of Russia. And there's a lot of objection to it today. In fact, the early Slavists who are now we're finding ourselves at the center of so much of this discussion, there's a move to say, don't include Kiev in Russian history. And in fact, there's a move to stop calling Russia Russia, because the name Russia belonged to everyone but Russia until the early modern period. So right from the very start, this book catapulted us into really meaningful historical debates. We decided it was important to include that in the book, both because it's a really interesting test case for our empire examination, and because the fact that it's a contested history tells us something about the lands that would fall under the aegis of the Russian Empire. The fact that the Russian Empire would scoop other peoples and nations and histories into its own is a big part of the imperial story. So I wanted to follow up on that point that Ron made. The other big framing of the book was we decided, we actually intended this to be a short analytical essay. As you said, it turned into kind of a big book, but it has the form of an analytical essay. We wanted to use the analytical concept of empire as a lens, as you said in your intro, for looking at this long history in as many times and aspects as we could, to see what that lens showed us that we might have missed otherwise. And we found the concept of empire itself is a messy one, a many-faceted one. So we could see imperial forms, imperial impulses, imperial claims in different places at different times. And that's something that we're finding very useful in thinking about the situation today as well. So that was the goal of the book, to test this concept. As Ron says, we find it's not useful in the early period, except that Rus forms in a crucible in which empires are the surrounding forms. And that puts an imprint on these histories that grow out of it.
I love that last statement that Val mentions, that is, so there's these bunch of people in Rus running around, and we even had difficulty trying to figure out what to call it, a constellation of states, not of states, but of peoples, tribes, warlords, mafia, whatever, different things. But there were states, and then imperial states, most importantly Byzantium, far to the south, that Rus was certainly conscious of, and that eventually would play a role in how they formed their own polities. Then later, at the end of this period, early period, you get the Mongols coming in, and that's also called an empire, very peculiar one, on horseback sort of, but still, an empire. And then eventually, it's in the early modern period, I guess we can call it that, when Moscow develops, and then this becomes what's called tsarstva, that is a tsardom, or an empire with the various Ivans, Ivan III, Ivan IV, Ivan the Terrible. And then we can talk about the way in which that empire is conceived and developed. And one of the things that Val demonstrated so beautifully in discussing the earlier period and then the shift to where her own research is most centered is that empire goes through different temporalities, you might call them. That is, empire begins with conquest, with war. That's really the first stage of empire. Nobody agrees necessarily. Well, actually, they do sometimes to be part of the empire, but generally, you get knocked on the head by a more powerful state and you're integrated into an empire. Empire, once it's formed, let's say largely by warfare, sometimes by dynastic marriages, sometimes by opportunistic treaties for protection. I study Georgia, and that seems to have happened with Georgia at one point. Once that happens, then you get this interesting realm called an empire. And this is something that we emphasize very strongly in the book, which is made up of two important elements, maybe more elements even. But I would start with one, difference. So empires are not egalitarian. They are not like modern nation states. We tend to forget, because we live in societies of at least theoretically equivalent and egalitarian citizenship, that most polities before the modern era were not equal. They were about some people being not only different, but superior to others. And our idea of empire was that this difference and the fact that some people, the ruling institutions, perhaps a certain ethnicity, is superior to others, gives the right to rule and dominate to those superiors over the inferiors. So our definition of empire not only was simply descriptive about difference and hierarchy, conquest initially, a certain amount of toleration, you might say, of diversity rather than homogenation of different peoples, that it's not just descriptive, it's also explanatory in a way. Because if the empire is built on some people being different and superior, and others being inferior and different, and the superiority gives them the right to rule over the others, then that difference and superiority has to be maintained in certain ways. And it makes it somewhat difficult, not impossible. Many empires will, or ancien regimes will evolve into something like nation states, but makes it difficult, at least some degree of difficulty, to move into this more egalitarian and homogeneous thing called the nation state. So that possibility, that explanatory dynamic was also explored in the book. Why, through centuries, did this Russian Empire, from, let's say, roughly the 16th century right up to 1917, not evolve as many of the old regimes in Europe did into something like a nation state, but maintained differences, diversity, and exploitation and superiority of some over others?
So I really want to circle back on this and talk more about that essential way that y'all are defining empire and the different sort of morphing ways that Russian history does or like kind of follows that, as you said, explanatory path, or the weird periods in Russian history where it kind of breaks a different way, right? Y'all mention in the introduction and at multiple points in the book, right? This is not kind of an overarching definition that can capture the whole sweep of Russian history. And like, I guess for historians like yourselves, right, that may seem like an obvious statement, but that's probably what's driving you nuts right now, because if people in the mainstream media are trying to do the exact opposite, right? We're trying to kind of back project onto Russian history some sort of like ontological desire for empire that Putin himself is embodying right now. And so I wanted to before we move on to talking about empire as you discuss it in the book, I wanted to go back to something that you said, Val, about the kind of historiographical debates that are happening right now as people in academia and outside of academia are trying to understand what they're watching, right? Because as we've talked about on a number of interviews here at The Real News, there were a lot of people, very informed people, who never expected that this would happen, right? It caught quite a few people inside Russia and outside Russia by surprise, right? So if Russian history and the figures in Russian government were so predictable and so easily explained, that already sort of presents a problem. But y'all mention in the conclusion, I think, like that sort of key image that has persisted, that we in the West especially have of Russia. And I just wanted to read this for viewers and listeners. So you write in the conclusion, quote, "The hoary images persist. Russia is once again seen as aggressive and expansionist. Only force, it is said repeatedly, can restrain its unrestrained ambitions. To many in the West, Russia was, is, and always will be an empire, autocratic and undemocratic within, and an imperialist danger to others abroad. By its very nature, it is said, Russia is doomed to be despotic and imperialist. Its inherent disposition is to confound the humanistic aspirations of civilized people, to dominate its neighbors, and to oppress its own people. Russia is now personified by Vladimir Putin, just as it has at times been subsumed into the images of Ivan the Terrible, Peter the Great, or Stalin." So I guess my first question is, how maddening is it to have written this whole book, to have worked on that, and then here in 2022, that's exactly where we're all right back to talking about Russian history? And I guess, could you give us a sense of what historians are trying to figure out right now, what historians are debating right now as this war unfolds in front of us?
Well, that's a big one. um, I mean, I guess I would start with your question about how it's affecting us, and I think we both share this real grief right now that we have spent our entire careers trying to disperse some of the clouds of obfuscation around Russia and to try to understand, to strip away the demonizing and look at the internal logics, without, of course, trying to minimize the horrific pieces of the history. But then, of course, we face this awful situation now where Russia is the aggressor and is sort of confirming all of those stereotypes. So there's a real kind of internal grief, but there's also a sense that the simplistic answers still don't suffice. So there is a tendency among historians now to say it's that old imperial pattern. And I think in our book, we would say, yeah, there are imperial patterns. Ron brought this term to us from political science of path dependency. Societies tend to follow patterns that have been set. And so we see these patterns continuing even in the Soviet period, which is explicitly and deliberately and consciously anti-imperial. Yet many of those furrows continue to be the sort of path of least resistance. Are there imperial elements at work today? Certainly. I think we can see aspects, and Ron and I were just talking before meeting with you. Empire is fundamentally opposed to the principle of national sovereignty. Empire is about running roughshod over borders and taking over power in other people's territories. That's the early phase of empire that Ron was talking about, the phase of outright military conquest. And yes, we can see this as a kind of imperial move. But empire, as our book shows, is also about prolonged periods of incorporating and even creating difference in order to maintain structures of hierarchy and differentiation. So what is that empire that people are so glibly ascribing to this moment? Another aspect in the historiographic debates right now is a tendency to move smoothly from aggression in Ukraine, which we see in front of our eyes, to a broader move to reconstitute either Soviet or imperial empire. Well, and to find the grand plan behind it, the thinker who inspires it and so forth. Looking at empires and how they don't grow by grand plan. They grow haphazardly by opportunity, by sparks, by particular moments of grievance. And so to predict the future on the basis of a grand plan, I mean, that's one of the few glimmers of light, I think, is it's a bit much to move from this one act of overt aggression to predict the pattern of the future.
I would add to that. That was wonderful, Val, and I agree completely. Of course, I would mention that this term empire is, which we tried to use analytically. So, what is it describing, and what can it explain? It also is not neutral. It has moral connotations. It's been used positively and negatively. Right up until the 20th century and through a large part of the 20th century, empire was terrific. People wanted to be empires. New York was the empire state. The sun never set on the British Empire. Winston Churchill was going to protect the British Empire after World War II. He didn't do that, but because there was Roosevelt and Stalin and a few others who had other ideas. But there were those kinds of positivities. But already from the early 20th century, there were negative views of empire, beginning, of course, with people like Hobson, a British theorist, with Lenin, of course, imperialism is the highest state of capitalism, with Woodrow Wilson in World War I and national self-determination, which was a slogan that both he and Lenin adopted. So there began to be criticisms of empire, and there was resistance to empire by colonized peoples already before the 20th century, and more actively in the 20th century. And empire had acquired all kinds of meanings, not only that it was kind of inevitably expansive, right? So that even some of the people commenting today are saying, Putin won't stop at Ukraine. He's going on to the Baltics, to Poland. Well, we'll see. And that is always a possibility. I was one who did not think he would make this outrageous blunder to go into Ukraine, but he did. So there's that aspect. There's also another discourse about empire. They're always doomed, right? What's the major view of empire? There's decline and fall from Gibbons on, and or the old man of Europe, the Ottoman Empire. And we watch the great empires of Central Europe, the Ottoman, the Habsburg, the Hohenzollern, the Second Reich. We saw them, the Romanovs, doomed after World War II. So there was a way in which when Ronald Reagan added that most important qualifier to empire, that the evil empire, that also stuck. And the evil empire was, of course, one that was doomed. And so a lot of thinkers, political, the President of the United States himself, many scholars as well, who have become quite prominent public intellectuals in the last half decade, are talking about this concept and using it both negatively and applying it to Russia, and eventually seeing it, you called it ontological, as the essential center of what Russia is. Russia has acted and may be acting right at the moment in what we would consider imperialistic ways, disregarding the independence and sovereignty and nationness of its neighbor state, denying it even in Putin's fanciful, fabricated histories that he's developed. So this view has now become very dominant, and it's hard to go back now and try to explain the alternative views of what was the impulse of and the contribution of NATO expansion or American global hegemonic ambitions. Those kinds of things are now marginalized, and the empire view of this essential expansionism is now the central metaphor.
Right, and I want to kind of end up there when we kind of round out this conversation, right? Because I think that I want to be very clear up front for everyone watching, right, that we don't want this discussion to be misinterpreted as trying to sort of explain some 100% some reason that is 100% germane to Russia and the Russian national character that explains this war, and as if we're pretending that all the outside interceding circumstances like NATO expansion, right, somehow play no part, right? That this can only be explained by looking into the dark heart of Russian empire, which Putin himself embodies, and that's the only way we can come to an understanding of why he would order the Russian military to invade Ukraine. So we're going to talk about that, but I want to just make sure that folks watching and listening have kind of a really clear sense of the concept of empire as you all work through it in your book. You gave Ron some of the sort of key definitional points, about how you are working with the concept of empire in this book. So can we bring that down to eye level with, you look at a number of different periods, right? You talk about how in certain periods what was happening in what we now call Russia more closely resembled the ideal form of empire as you describe it, and there are other periods where it was kind of a heterogeneous mix of different forms. So I guess within the context of some of the history that you look at, can we talk a bit more for viewers and listeners about how this definition of empire has that explanatory power that you were talking about, an analytical power?
Well, maybe maybe a nice place to look is the 19th century. So the early 19th century is what Ron calls the moment of the nation. It's the time when the idea of nations as collections of equals in whom sovereignty resides, who have some kind of bond among them, starts to catch fire across Europe and across the globe. This is the antithesis of empire, which is about verticality and difference. Nation is about horizontality and equality. So it's a problem. But in the mid 19th century, the Russian emperor Alexander II realizes something has to be done about this serfdom situation, especially in the face of the rising tide of nation. And so Alexander II precedes the US in emancipating the serfs. So this is a great move. He's created sort of citizens from subjects. He creates, his government creates electoral bodies and judicial bodies and all sorts of things that are sort of marching in that direction. But they just cannot do it on an equal basis. So they create differential voting rights for different groups of people. Peasants have one set, townspeople, nobles, they have their own sets of rights. They have their own courts. This ingrained habit of imperial thinking and ruling through difference is perpetuated even as they're trying their hardest to institute egalitarianism. It cannot happen. It doesn't compute. So that's one nice example. Maybe if I could just give one other quick example. In the later 19th century, Russification is kind of a catchword, and a lot of textbooks talk about this oppressive policy of Russification, which meant forcing other peoples of the empire to give up their own languages, cultures, and follow in the Russian track. And there certainly is that kind of cultural policy that's pretty cruelly enforced, fiercely enforced in places. In other places, local languages are encouraged if they somehow serve the interests of the imperial state. So even this policy of making everyone Russian is not actually making everyone Russian. It's making some people Russian at some times at some places.
And Val and I went on in. I will go on into the Soviet period. So, why do we think the Soviet Union is an empire? And is that a useful category or tool to understand what's going on in the Soviet Union? As Val mentioned, the Soviet Union was, I guess you could call it, a self-denying empire, just like the United States. They're countries that, in fact, liberated themselves from empire. That's what the Americans did. And that's what the Soviets did. They got rid of the empire and they became anti-imperialist in their rhetoric, but not always in their practice. And over time, though the Soviet Union was now made up of literally hundreds of different peoples and 15 or 16 different union republics eventually, all sovereignty in that empire was in Moscow. And only drips and pieces of decision-making were left to the constituent republics or peoples. So it was a dominated empire, not a Russian empire, not an ethnic empire, but an empire, a communist empire, an empire of the highest levels of the Communist Party, the general secretary, the Politburo, the nomenclatura, over the rest of the people. In fact, it was an empire that was imperial vis-a-vis its Russian, ethnic Russian subjects as much as its non-Russian subjects as well. In fact, you could say that about the imperial period. So what does that tell us? Well, it tells us that, again, it ruled through ideas of superiority and inferiority, even as it proclaimed an egalitarian message and ideology. So Marxism-Leninism was about equality, liberation of the working class, etc. But some people were more equal than others, as George Orwell puts it so well in Animal Farm. And that's a beautiful metaphor for the way the Soviet Union actually acted. I'll never forget going to the Soviet Union as an American, a young American, 25, 26 years old, to work in the Lenin Library. And there were different cloakrooms for different people. It's impossible in America. That is, academicians, and by the way, 25-year-old foreigners, had cloakroom number 1, garderobe numero 1, right? And then other Soviet citizens were in cloakroom number 2 or number 3 and number 4. In other words, these hierarchies persisted even down to the nitty-gritty and everyday of life, right? So there was a sense in which I as a young lefty, by the way, very sympathetic to, in many ways, what was going on in the Soviet Union, was stunned by the way this project of socialism was actually being carried out in what was really an imperial setting.
Right. I feel like there's a short story I recall reading, maybe it was in a bathhouse, but it was by Mikhail Zoshenko, that kind of speaks to this like weird stratification that happens even at the most mundane levels of Soviet society. And I think like just that's something that's been really generative and helpful for me to understand, right? Empire, as y'all are discussing it, right? Not necessarily as just something that explains when a nation state expands, right, or why it expands, right? You know, this has been part of the intra left debate where people are talking about Lenin, right? You know, that I'm not going to sum up, you know, like Lenin's entire thesis for everyone here. You can go check it out. But essentially, if capitalism in kind of within the confines of certain nations needs to keep finding new ways to make and extract profit, it's going to inevitably go beyond the borders of those individual nations. It's going to formulate this sort of international network of finance capital to sort of keep extracting and exploiting, you know, other parts of the country, thus the imperial sort of designs therein. Anyway, the reason that I mentioned that is that kind of understanding empire in the terms that y'all are discussing, right, makes it feel, again, like we're talking about different forms of societal administration, I suppose, is like how I would put it, right? Like to maintain a sort of empire means to have a sort of rule, as you said, by instantiating and reinforcing the difference of the collected subjects within the confines of that whole empire. Whereas, like, you know, the ideal form of a nation state is one that takes different heterogeneous population groups in a population and sort of tries to, again, like coalesce them around a sort of shared national identity, so on and so forth. I'm being reductive. Again, this is hundreds of pages worth of good reading that everyone should check out to fully flesh this out. But I thought it was exceedingly relevant, obviously, because, you know, if you listen to Putin and if you listen to, you know, people in Russia who are in favor of this war, right, there is something really kind of, I don't know, ethnically telling, right? Like if they're arguing that in fact Ukraine is not, you know, a different sort of people, but they have been sort of exiled. They're exiled Russians, right? And that need to be brought back into the fold. So I guess there's not a necessarily neat definition here, but I wanted to ask you before we kind of hit the final turn, like, what role Ukraine plays in, I guess this history of empire that you all study. I mean, even going back to the beginning of Kievan Rus, right? I guess for folks who are watching and viewing, do we see that sort of odd sort of way that Russia is relating to Ukraine right now? Is that something that extends deep into the history of Russian empire?
Absolutely. Absolutely. It's such a fascinating relationship where Ukraine itself, I just was showing a historical map of Ukraine to a class the other day. And you look at the the timing when different pieces came under Russian rule. You can see Ukraine has such a rich history of entanglement with Russia and with other cultures. So it's got I mean, this claim that they are Russia and they have no distinctiveness. You just look at the map and you can see this is a part of the world that really is at the crossroads and has all the richness of all those cultures and all the tensions of being and suffering of being at those crossroads. Um, so that's one part of an answer. I think is that being at the crossroad of empires uh, is an imperial experience. I guess the other piece that I would talk about is that Ukrainian influences in Russian culture are profound and ancient. So if we think about Kiev Rus, Kievan Rus sets the template for many of the major institutions and cultural practices that will become Russian, like Orthodoxy. Then in the 17th century, when a big piece of left bank Ukraine joins Russia, they bring this very advanced theological, artistic, Baroque cultural template to Moscow and completely change Moscow's face. So that relationship is imperial in that these Ukrainians are coming to Moscow as the center of power and patronage and money and jobs, but they're also bringing pieces to Moscow that wouldn't have been there at all without that Ukrainian interaction.
I think, Max, it might be useful to make the distinction between nation and state. So in English, we tend to mix the two. So the United Nations is actually United States, a bunch of states. But in our book and elsewhere, I think political scientists and historians have sometimes tried to distinguish them in different ways. And the way we sort of distinguish it is a state is an institution. It has, the monopoly of over legitimate violence in a territory. That's Max Weber's famous definition. It has institutions, bureaucracies, armies, etc. The state. That's the one that taxes you or drafts you into the army and so forth. And a nation is, in its the meaning that we would give it, is people. It's a bunch of people who imagine that they are similar to one another. They share a culture. It could be ethnic culture, religious culture, civic culture, principles of governance, whatever. And as a result, and as a consequence of that shared culture, they have the right to some political representation, autonomy, sovereignty, a state of their own, and what goes along with that? A little bit of the world's real estate, namely a homeland territory, right? Now, Putin has, in his fabricated histories, argued that in some ways, Russians and Ukrainians are Yedini Narod. They are one people, which appears to then deny that Ukraine is a nation with its full nationness, even though it's had a history, different language, different culture, and people imagine and believe they are a nation. which to us is sufficient to be a nation. And they're ready to fight and die for it. They're becoming every day, as we speak, more and more of a coherent, conscious nation. Sadly, that nation is being conceived, understandably, as anti-Russian, as hostile to Russia. Just what Putin didn't want, he's in fact creating a more Western-oriented, anti-Russian nation, Ukraine. At the same time, Putin has, in a sense, denied that Ukraine is a state, or let's say a legitimate state. Look, he says, it was created by Lenin. Now, I am not anti-Leninist, but I never in my teachings ever went as far as Putin to say that Ukraine was made as a state by Lenin. There was declarations of statehood at different times, most importantly in 1918 by the nationalists, Rada, and so forth. Eventually, a Soviet Socialist Republic of Ukraine was formed, and Lenin gave pieces of that had been in some of those provinces to Ukraine. They made a Ukrainian state, and in making that state, because of the nature of empire, where people moved around and migrated here and there, many of the people who were included in Ukraine were either ethnically Russian or Russian speakers. So Ukraine, Soviet Ukraine, was a mixed state, majority Ukrainian, but also with significant minorities of Russians and Russian speakers. By the way, lots of Jews too, until most of them were murdered during the Holocaust in the Second World War. So it was a complex state. And then later, Stalin, after World War II, incorporated Ukrainian parts of Poland, interwar Poland, into Ukraine, right? And finally, in 1954, Khrushchev gave Crimea, a largely Russian province or Russian-speaking province, to Ukraine as a gift, right, to mark the friendship between these peoples. So in a funny way, the state of Ukraine was created piecemeal in its present existence during the Soviet period. And during that period, Ukrainian nationhood also grew through policies of both negative and positive, policies of supporting Ukrainian culture, then under Stalin, horrific repressions, including the famous Holodomor, the death famine in which millions of people died, and the crushing of Ukrainian nationalist elites and so forth. So you have a complex history there. But there can be no denying by any honest person and anyone looking at this history that there can be no denying that Ukraine is a nation state. It both has a conscious, coherent nation, which we can call Ukrainians, of mixed ethnicity or language often, and also that it is a state. And Russia itself, including Putin, has recognized that this was a state, and they've made agreements. The famous Minsk II agreements, with Putin would like to see implemented, were made with a government, a sovereign government in Kiev. So, this fabricated history, if you don't know history, must be rejected. It's absurd.
Well, and I guess that kind of brings us to the final turn, which is, I suppose in a very kind of crass way, a question about how much history can tell us about this moment, right? How much explanatory power, right, all of this has, right, to make sense of what we are watching unfold. And again, as I mentioned before, I really want to stress for viewers and listeners that we are not trying to convey to y'all that this whole catastrophe can somehow be understood as something coming from within Russia only, right? There are many internal and external factors that cause this horror, and there will be unpredictable internal and external factors that shape the outcome. But clearly, people are trying in real time to sort of update their definitions of empire and imperialism, and to try to kind of make sense of this. And as you all noted in your book, which again came out, in 2017, even the very concept of empire feels almost antiquated. It feels like something like, very much in the rearview mirror of human history, which is why I think we are all kind of fumbling for ways to apply it to the war in Ukraine. And so I guess I wanted to ask, not necessarily, for your grand interpretation of what is happening here, but how you are yourselves using this history, this analysis that you've conducted together over many years, like how perhaps in the classroom with your students are you talking through this? Like, what are you emphasizing for them? What questions do they have that you think can really be answered by the things that we've been discussing here? I guess I'm really kind of, again, asking for folks who are consuming media in a very unhealthy kind of media landscape, especially during times of war, but not exclusively. How can we kind of take this important research that y'all put out in your book, this important frame for understanding empire and Russian history? How can this better help us sort of make sense of what we are watching with the war in Ukraine here in 2022?
Val has heard me say this many times. I'm going to say three things. One, history is always contested. We see that in the United States with these textbook wars, with the school board hearings, etc. History is fraught, and it's never simple. It's complex, and people are going to fight over it. Governments will try to seize it and tell it in a certain way. We see that in Russia today. I hope it's not working well, but it's important to governments. Why? Point two, history is a subversive science. It undermines mythologies. It undermines comfortable, unquestioned truths. It undermines what people think is common sense about their own countries, their own histories. And therefore, it's so important because we begin to question things. And thirdly, most importantly, I think, and I say this to my students all the time, history, and I'm saying this as someone who's been and is a political scientist as well, history is the only database we have. The only source of information, empirical facts, theories, and interpretations that can tell us what happened in the past, how we got here where we are today, and what potential directions we might move in the future. And if you falsify that history, or as is done, leave things out, that seems to be the chosen mode of falsification, the holes, the lacunae, you'll get the wrong picture and you'll move in a direction that you don't want to move. I give you an example. I'm so sad to say this. I watched the other night a Frontline documentary on Putin and the war in Ukraine. And I love Frontline. It's a good progressive program, very critical. But this documentary was clearly done in a hurry. And in the whole run-up to the war and Putin, it was all a kind of psychoanalysis of a demonic Putin with not a single mention of the West, of the expansion of NATO, of the placing of rockets in Eastern Europe, or any of the things that might have led Putin into this delusional mood that eventually resulted in this horrific and stupid invasion. So leaving things out is very dangerous. And what we're trying to do, I think, is say, yes, we're not excusing in any way what's happened, because this is an unprovoked war and it's disastrous for Ukraine, for Russia, for the West, for everybody, for historians, but also to try to understand the complexities, not the reductive simplifications that have led us to where we are today.
Yeah, I agree with all of that, which isn't always the case. Ron and I don't always agree. So,
but we remain friends.
Yeah, I think drawing the lessons, it's complicated. It's always complicated. I think that the point I made earlier about not immediately predicting that because Putin has chosen this hideous course in Ukraine, that necessarily means he's going to try to reconstitute the entire Russian Empire. I think a little caution with applying labels as explanations is in order. Although I also agree with Ron that the past is our database for the future. Figuring out what about the past is determinative is, of course, or directive is difficult. I think maybe the lessons I would stress are more about us, about our society, that Putin very deliberately targeted history years ago. He decreed that happy histories of Russia had to be told. That's not easy. Telling a happy history of Russia, it's a history with a pretty dark cast. He started fabricating these concocted fairy tales about the non-existence of Ukraine and the oneness of the people who he then was going to bomb, which is very confusing. But history was his in. And when we look at what's going on with attempts to control textbooks in this country, to crack down on truth and multiple voices in history, to demonize something that the right understands as critical race theory, as being un-American, these are equally dangerous moves. And we know what direction book banning and book burning and reconfiguring history take. So I think there are a lot of lessons to be learned, a lot of warning signs and warning flags held up for ourselves as well.
And if you take these representations and these metaphors very seriously, empire and democracy versus autocracy, all of which have some purchase, all of which explain some things, but you can get yourself into a situation such as both sides got into during the Cold War, where they so dichotomized the sides that there was no room for really negotiation, figuring ways out of crisis. And I fear that by ideologizing this whole struggle once again, it's becoming more and more difficult to find ways to, because we've got to live together in some way. Someone mentioned that Ukraine is right next door to Russia. They're going to have to be neighbors. Turkey and Armenia better find a way to talk to each other, Azerbaijan and Armenia, because these countries aren't going to move physically from one place to another. And maybe history can help, but bad histories are going to confuse people and lead us in the wrong way.
So that is Ronald Grigor Suny, the William H. Sewell Jr. Distinguished University Professor of History and Professor of Political Science at the University of Michigan, an Emeritus Professor of Political Science and History at the University of Chicago, and Valerie A. Kivelson, the Thomas N. Tentler Collegiate Professor and Arthur F. Thurnow Professor of History at the University of Michigan. Together, they are the authors of Russia's Empires, which everyone should read. Again, there was no way we could capture, the broad sweep of this, important and extensive book, but we hope we have given you at least the encouragement you need to go read it yourself and to use these this research and these analytical tools to better understand our place in the world and what we're watching unfold. Ron, Val, thank you so much for joining me today.
Thank you.
Thank you. It was great.
For everyone watching, this is Maximillian Alvarez for the Real News Network. Before you go, please head on over to therealnews.com/support. Become a monthly sustainer of our work so we can keep bringing you important coverage and conversations just like this. Thank you so much for watching.